Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Wahai semua saudara-saudaraku, seluruh rakyat Indonesia, dari Sabang sampai Merauke, mudah-mudahan kita semuanya selalu diberikan kekuatan iman dan Islam dan juga kekuatan dohiriyah dan batiniah oleh Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, sehingga kita bersama yaitu dapat mempertahankan negeri Indonesia ini yaitu dari tangan-tangan penjajah. Perlu kita ketahui bahwa sesungguhnya negara Indonesia itu adalah negara yang sangat ingin dikuasai oleh yaitu orang-orang asing, negara-negara asing seperti itu, karena sesungguhnya yang sebetulnya adalah perang ini adalah perang agama, wahai saudara-saudaraku. Untuk itu saya akan yaitu menerangkan dan akan menampilkan sebuah yaitu video dari seorang penulis yaitu sang peneliti yaitu dari Belanda, wahai saudaraku, yang bernama yaitu Marjolein van Vag. Untuk itu mari kita dengarkan bagaimana dia menceritakan tentang yaitu kelamnya negara Indonesia dijajah oleh Belanda, wahai saudara-saudaraku. Mari kita dengarkan videonya.
Hi, my name is Marjolein van Pagé and I'm a history researcher from the Netherlands, currently following a master in colonial history. And I'm also the founder of Historie Bersama, an online bilingual platform that focuses on Dutch and Indonesian perspectives of colonial history. And for this occasion, I wish to say a few words about how the Netherlands had been dealing with colonial atrocities they committed against the Indonesians. First, I will give you a little bit historical background, and secondly, I want to conclude with my opinion about recent developments. It seems that there is some kind of paradox, because on one hand, already so many Dutch books have been written about the colonial past in Indonesia, so it's hard to call it a forgotten history. But on the other hand, it remains a commonly unknown history. It is not really part of our national memory. Just like other Western imperialists, the Dutch East Indian Company, the VOC, used brutal violence to establish their rule. And one of the first and most known colonial genocides goes back to the year of 1621, when Jan Pieterszoon Koen murdered almost all the inhabitants of Banda, a small island that was famous for nutmeg. Much later, early 19th century, the Dutch East Indies became a colony of the Netherlands. Almost 400 years after the genocide of Banda, on August 17, 1945, Indonesia proclaimed the independence. The refusal of the Netherlands to recognize it led to a bloody guerrilla war that lasted until 1949. For the Netherlands, it was the largest colonial military operation so far, and involving more than 150,000 soldiers, one of which was my grandfather. An estimated 150,000 Indonesians died, of which many were just civilians. And besides that, also 15,000 Dutch and other pro-Dutch Indonesians were murdered out of anti-colonial hatred. That was fueled again by the obvious disrespect of the Dutch for the new Indonesian state. Subsequently, during the conflict, also 6,000 soldiers died in their aim to restore colonial rule in the region that we now know as Indonesia. But when the Dutch government finally recognized Indonesia's sovereignty in 1949, it was not the end of the story. They forced the Indonesian government to take over the colonial debts of about 4.5 billion guilders, while most of the companies remained in Dutch hands. Indonesia actually paid off a large part of this debt until 1956, when out of frustration they nationalized all Dutch companies. But also this was not the end of the story. Later on, in 1967, they made a new agreement, and Indonesia had to pay another 600 million guilders to compensate the loss of these Dutch companies. Not many people know that the Netherlands received the last payment of this amount only in 2002. Meanwhile, on several different occasions, stories about Dutch war crimes came to light, yet never really leading to a significant change of the national narrative. Then, 10 years ago, in 2008, Jeffrey Pondaar, an Indonesian living in the Netherlands, together with Dutch human rights lawyer Lisbeth Zegveld, supported Indonesian war victims and successfully sued the Dutch state. Through these court cases, the Dutch government was forced to apologize and had to pay compensation to the Indonesian widows whose husband had been executed at the time. As a consequence of this new legal step, the interest of Dutch journalists and historians was growing and more publications appeared. In 2012, 3 Dutch institutions asked the Dutch government to fund a new large-scale investigation. First, their request was denied based on the excuse that Indonesia did not want to cooperate. But in 2016, the Dutch government finally agreed and made 4 million euros available. For 4 years, a team of researchers will be studying extreme violence, as they call it, through 8 sub-projects. And one of the project leaders plans to summarize all their findings together in one synthesis later on. Yet, there are certain issues with the approach. I am not very confident about the outcome. And that is why, last November, a critical open letter, signed by 126 people, was sent to the Dutch government to address the problems. The first critique is that there are conflicting interests, because one of the participating institutions falls directly under the Dutch Ministry of Defense. In fact, they are responsible for the historical verification of the Indonesian legal claims. Also quite remarkable was that for the kick-off event, the Indonesian human rights activist Jeffrey Pondaar was not invited. As someone who fought for decades to create more awareness for these issues in the Netherlands, I found it simply unacceptable that the team chose to ignore him. I think it's partly because of his activism, in combination with the political pressure of the legal claims, that the Dutch government felt the need to support this investigation. But perhaps the most worrisome of all is that the research does not problematize colonialism as such. To me, it seems as if they depart from the idea that the existence of the colony is just normal. They do not question the legitimacy. Apparently, their point of departure is when 2 parties fight, there are 2 parties to blame, not explaining about the unequal power structure behind it. And one of the project leaders even suggested that the Indonesian violence triggered the Dutch soldiers to commit war crimes as well. As if they wouldn't have done that when Indonesians would not have been so violent. To me, that is the problem in reverse. Because how brutal the anti-colonial massacres might have been, it is not where this all started. Just remember the story about Banda. Equally worrisome is that none of the 8 sub-projects deals with the colonial mindset as trigger for war crimes. To me, what the research is doing now is like explaining the Holocaust without studying the Nazi ideology. And what about the psychological impact of hundreds of years of occupation, the humiliation, racism? In that regard, is the violence between 45 and 49 not just a consequence? When zooming in on the violence of this last colonial war, as they are doing now, counting the victims, analyzing the political, military and internationally decision-making, I'm afraid it will never produce a sufficient answer on why this conflict was so violent. In short, what I miss from the setup and the presentation of this investigation is the notion that a colony is a human rights violation to begin with. Therefore, I conclude with the statement that whatever Dutch soldiers did in Indonesia, their presence alone was a violation